So Professor Rodrigo Nunes, who I've known for a while, has done really, really interesting interventions. I recall when I first came across your work that I really respected and regarded what you're working on in terms of affective labor and the kind of autonomy, the autonomous movement, and some of those your critical interventions of those stages where we really had to start thinking about how to reorient concepts in term to adapt to some of the most contemporary sort of political pressures and threats, which I found you did very coherently and with really interesting philosophical ontology. And so you're a professor of modern and contemporary philosophy at the Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, and you've authored many things. So the organization of the organization list, collective action after networks. You've got neither vertical nor horizontal, a theory of political organization, which you're going to be talking about today. Your writings appeared in publications like the Temps Moderne, Radical Philosophy, South Atlantic Quarterly, International Journal of Communication, and I won't keep reading. Here, I'm very happy to be able to announce you today. And then we have David Bailey, Melany, Cruz, and I'll introduce you when we get to your bit. And so I'm going to be a fairly strict timekeeper, but at the same time, please, we're all really looking forward to what you have to say about this brilliant book. And I will say no more, but to let you go ahead and speak. And great. Thank you for being here, Rodrigo. It's really nice to
Well, thank you, Phoebe. Thank you very much for suggesting me to this session originally, and thank you very much for the introduction. And thank you very much, David, for accepting the suggestion and the invitation, and for Melany for then accepting our invitation to be one of the discussants for this session. It's a pleasure to be with the three of you and everyone else who turned up. I apologize if I have a coughing fit halfway through this first intervention, but I've been a bit sick since Friday. I don't know if I'm sick from the booster shot that I took on Friday, or if I managed to get sick in parallel to the booster shot, but either way, I got a booster shot and I'm sick. So apologies in advance if I start coughing or, I don't know, die. We're supposed to be very brief here, so I'm just gonna try to say very, very briefly what I tried to do with this book, more than what I actually did. And hopefully for those of you who haven't read the book, this will sound interesting enough that you will then want to pursue it further by actually reading it. But basically my idea with this book, with neither vertical nor horizontal, was to write an intervention that would work on 4 different levels. The first level is obviously a theoretical level, as the subtitle of the book says. The book purports to be a theory of political organization. So it is, on one level, it is that, and it draws from a number of different theoretical sources in order to do that, from Spinoza, Bogdanov, cybernetics, Marxism, from different scientific discourses on self-organization, so on and so forth. And my idea with that was basically to propose a new language in which people from different political traditions could talk about organization, because I felt that the language we had was unhelpful for reasons that some of which will maybe become clearer. And at the same time, what I was trying to do was, in a way, to write a new operating system within old questions that had been cast aside in the last, I'd say, 4 decades. Questions like leadership, like discipline, but also newer questions or newer problems like horizontality. The idea was to write a new operating system within which these different questions could run, but could run in a different way. The second level of the intervention was historical, and here I was trying to describe a very broad historical arc that starts with the birth of the modern idea of revolution at the start of the modern age, goes through the transformations through which this idea has gone through, particularly in the latter half of the 20th century, but most of all concentrates on what I take to be the present conjuncture that we're in from a theoretical and political point of view, which started in the 80s. And I suggest in the book might be coming to an end, might have finally come to an end now. And the book is also an attempt to help bring this conjuncture, this theoretical political conjuncture, to an end. The third level is an attempt to draw a balance sheet of the experiences of the last decade. Even though I'm drawing from this much longer history and from a greater breadth of examples from movements, political movements, and social movements from different times and places. But it is, at the same time, it is mostly to these experiences of the last decade, and I'm talking here about the period that starts with the global cycle of struggles that began with the Arab Spring, and then sees the electoral turn to campaigns like Bernie Sanders in the US, or Podemos in Spain, or Jeremy Corbyn's period as a leader of the Labour Party, etc. Then the rise of the far right towards the end of the last decade, etc. So it is mostly to these experiences that I'm referring to in order to try and draw the lessons I think can be drawn from the last decade, but also to address the public that I take to be the public that I'm mostly speaking to, precisely the people who've been through these experiences of the last decade, and also to address this political theoretical conjuncture that began in the 80s and that I think started to come to an end in the last decade. The fourth level then is could be described as a clinical or a therapeutic intervention in this particular conjuncture, in the more locally, more specifically in the conjuncture of the last decade, but also in its relationship to this broader conjuncture that began in the 80s and 90s. And what I'm trying to intervene on in this case is, first of all, what I identify as a trauma of organization, namely the trauma of the experiences of that different emancipatory projects in the 20th century went through, which I believe, and which generates the fear of collective action or organized collective action beyond a certain scale, and which I think obscures this trauma, the fear that, organization could, the organization that we give ourselves in order to pursue an emancipatory project could in itself become an instrument of oppression or an instrument of domination. While that is, of course, a perfectly legitimate fear, it tends to obscure what I call the pharmacological nature of organization. And what I mean by that is that by attuning us to the dangers of the excess of organization, it tends to obscure the fact that the lack of organization is also a problem. So it tends to stress too much organization as a source of danger and not enough organization as an enabling condition, i.e. as a means to enhance a collective capacity to act. The other thing that this clinical intervention tries to address is what I describe as a double melancholia. I take this idea of left melancholia, which, as you know, the concept was first introduced by Walter Benjamin at the start of the 20th century, but it has been revived again and again since then, and particularly so in the last, since the 90s, I would say in particular, and I think for perfectly obvious reasons. But I take this idea of left melancholia and suggest that actually we have the defeats of two major, we could say perhaps the two major models of social change in the 20th century, which as a shorthand, which we could identify as 1917 and 1968. Obviously, there's a lot to problematize in those, in that simplification, but schematically, we can use those dates as to signal the distinction between these two major models. The defeat of these two major models actually generates two different camps locked in their own melancholia, which locks them in mutual opposition to one another, which means that once they tend to, which means that once they resist recognizing the limits that these models have encountered, and they tend to present the field of options available to us or available to anyone engaged in an emancipatory project from now on, to a set of exclusive disjunctives, such as, you have to choose between autonomy or hegemony, micro or macro politics, so on and so forth. Whereas I suggest one of the functions that organization was historically called upon to perform was precisely to act as a mediator between these opposites, which have tended to be treated since the 80s or 90s as being mutually exclusive, as being things that you had to choose between. So I think that was basically all I had the time for. Wasn't
Great.
everything I had planned to say, but I'm sure there'll be time to come back to the bits that I skipped when we have the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rodrigo. That was excellent. And so we have two discussants now. So I'll introduce you first, Melany. So you are a lecturer in international politics at the University of Leicester, where I was recently working and no longer. And your research focuses on theories of violence and nonviolence, with particular interest in resistance movements, feminism, and progressive politics in Latin America. And you've published articles on Chile's social uprising and the newly elected progressive government in Tribune magazine. And you're also leading on some very interesting work where you have a forthcoming workshop on digitalization and some resistance, which looks like a really interesting one, which maybe I can put in the chat so people can kind of see what other work you're doing. So welcome, really happy to have you. Go ahead and if you wanted to give your interventions now as well.
Thank you, Phoebe. Yes, yes, please. I think the main organizer of that event that is happening on Monday is also in here today, Marco. So for those who want to continue the discussion about progressive politics, please just check that event. I think Phoebe is going to put it on the chat now. So yes, thank you to Phoebe, David, and Rodrigo for inviting me today to discuss this very interesting and quite illuminating book on theories of organization. I don't, because we just have 10 minutes to sort of comment a few of these themes. I don't want to spend too much time thinking through the theoretical composition of the book, which I found very, very convincing, but more just tell why this book kind of becomes very, very useful to understand a political process that's still ongoing in Chile since 2019. So I'm just going to focus on how I consider that there's probably two elements that I don't know if Rodrigo spent too much time talking in the book, but I think there could be an interesting component of this idea of organization as an ecology, as an active process that involved the collaboration and contestation of different networks or parties or individuals that are in constant movement in the organizing for political and social transformation. I'm very, very interested in this idea of that Rodrigo talks in the book of how the forces and not just the forms, not just the strategy, but the forces are capable of building particular moments, but how these moments of transformation, but how these need to be sensitive to the context and the power relations that exist in a specific time and place. That there is perhaps in an old saying, but there's no recipe to organize, right? There is no ticking box that we can all follow, and therefore we can win certain gains for whatever demand or popular demand or social demand or economic demand we're looking for. So that's when I go back to 2019 when we had this social uprising in October, and the first analysis that came out from that process was to think about, well, this is very horizontal. There was no organization, right? This was literally the people, the masses coming out in the street, sort of burst into this kind of new consciousness against neoliberalism. And I always had troubles with that interpretation of the process, especially because obviously there is a longer history. I'm not gonna get into now, but because there were two elements that were consistent in that process. One of them was the intervention of the feminist movement within the social uprising, and the second, the continuation of the student movement. So those things kind of like speak to this ecology as is placed in argue in this book. The first element is the intervention of the feminist movement in the kind of national scale in the politics of protest, but also in the sort of national discourse since 2018, with the rise of organizations like Coordinadora 8 de Marzo, but as well Ni Una Menos, as kind of like an expanded movement of different kind of perhaps nodes, as they talk in the book, small nodes that they were starting to connect around the issue of violence against women, but also the correlation between feminicide and state violence. the intervention that these organizations started doing was absolutely key for the maintenance and for the continuation of the uprising from October to November. In fact, when I spoke with activists in feminist or different feminist organizations, one of the key common themes is that how the intervention of particularly Las Tesis performance gave a new high into the uprising, allowed the reorganization of the social protests, the reorganization of the demands into perhaps a more feminist focus. Another element that I found interesting and kind of like I find it illuminating in this book to understand this process in Chile was that feminism and feminist activists were not concentrated in one network. There was no one simple organization that could sort of like establish what is their political demand or what is their strategy to organize that demand into the Chilean society. Feminists, although largely characterized within this Coordinadora 8 de Marzo, they spread out in different other organizations. So they exist within within trade unions, within political parties, and of course, the more dispersed, perhaps the individual feminists, right? That they were not members of any of these organizations, but when it was time to build up the social protests, they made the numbers, right? Because we see obviously this as a mass movement, especially then with the coordination of the women's strikes, the International Women's Day. And the second aspect that I think sort of also helped me to reflect about this process of uprising in Chile, which I know more about, but I guess it could be extended to what happened in Colombia as well, the sort of anti-neoliberal sort of uprisings, social uprisings, is the continuation of a movement. So what, or the continuation of an organization. And in Chile, this is particularly attached to the student movement. I mean, it's no coincidence that those who were the leaders of the student movement in 2011 now are in government, and one of them is the president of the country. So that continuation speak to me of an ecology as well. And this is something perhaps for the discussion later with Rodrigo, but like, how do you read that continuation of organization? The ability of a particular movement, in this case, the student movement, to reshape themselves, not just in demands, and start connecting the demand of education with all the social and political demands in the country, but also how those leaderships are also spread out, and how they were able to move from the kind of traditional student union movement toward the formation of new political parties that now are the kind of in government, right, and become institutionalized, but the formation of new political parties outside the institutional or traditional party from that party structure that we had in the 90s and 2000s. Because what I find that is key in this book is all the theoretical elements that are quite rich and interesting to use as material and frameworks, but is to understand that this idea of ecology or organization, it has to be placed in context, and it has to be a kind of invitation for activists and for people involved in what so-called self-organization, and to understand the time and space and the ability to change and reshape those forms of organizing. I don't know how much time I have because I haven't checked. Sorry, Phoebe, but you cut me out if I'm going over.
Yeah, you have a couple more minutes. Go ahead.
You're right. Thank you. So my thinking along the book is to see where conflict plays as also another question. So one thing is about continuation and how organizations can reshape themselves over time, and in order to build power or force to win something, right? But another point I was sort of like interested on is the idea of conflict that exists within organizations. I mean, if I understood correctly from the book, there is an invitation to avoid competition, right? And to sort of stimulate cooperation, which I think in the context of what I was explaining with the social uprising, we saw a lot of that cooperation that led to the formation of the Constitutional Convention and the writing of the new constitution, and later on this year with the election of this new progressive government. But I wonder how much of that conflict it is about competition, and it is about ideological differences, and what happened when you win something, let's say a progressive government, and we still continue with that sort of battle of ideas within organizing within organizations. And obviously, if the lessons of the 2011 period in Europe, for example, can teach us something in terms of avoiding that break, that sort of ideological battle of ideas that could lead to the breaking of organizations, then of the continuation of organizations. So I think I will leave it there, so we have more time for questions. But yeah, thank you. So very, very interesting and great book.
Thank you so much, Melany. I appreciate that. And we now have David Bailey, who is, of course, the current coordinator and lead for the Critical Political Economy Research Network. He has published a significant amount of work on comparative political economy. He's an activist, and he's based at the University of Birmingham. And I'm going to turn it over to you, David. Are you ready? Do you have any special requests? Okay, very, very good to have you, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thanks. No special requests. Thank you. Yeah, great. Thanks, and thanks for the opportunity to talk about the book. And also, it was. I mean, it's very welcome. I really enjoyed reading it, and I mean, I think the main thing I enjoyed reading about it is the kind of optimism that I found in the book. In one way, it's like it's very affirmative, and I like that. And I like the optimism. I mean, it seemed to me it's affirmative in multiple ways. I mean, in one sense, the kind of core argument, I think, which is that we should be doing things like distributed leadership, having an ecology of movements, being experimental, thinking about the best possible kind of ways to win in our struggles. I think the kind of optimism is that possibly we're already doing those anyway, whether we realize it or not, that there's a kind of ultimately we are doing that, and there's a need to affirm the fact that we are doing that and to think through what that means. So in a sense, that optimism comes because we're doing what we should be doing anyway, maybe, but we perhaps want to do it more. But also an optimism, I think, and an affirmation in the sense of, like, when you read it, there's the sense that there's a part of a community, there's like a community discussion which is going on within the book, that there's like the notion of that the failure of the trauma of 1917 and the trauma of 1968, and the movement towards a kind of anti-globalization movement, and the 2011 as a shared experience, and the 2010s as a period when we were kind of wrestling with the notion of, you know, how do we relate to the state? Is populism the answer? And now, where are we now kind of question, that is talking through and to a shared kind of community and a shared discussion. And that I found also quite affirmative, because it first of all, it affirms the fact that there is that there is a group of people that are engaged in that discussion, and that's who it's speaking to. And and so in that sense, it's almost, the book itself is also doing what it's arguing we should be doing, which is the notion of which is deal with the question of what you call political subjectivation, that there needs to be a process of political subjectivation in order for political subjects to be able to act. And so through the act of constructing a we, that we become able to act. And so you talk in the book about this question of, well, do we need a party to create that? And also perhaps, with the engagement with populism, do we need engage with nationalism and the nation state maybe? but it also made me think, well, actually, there's a sort of shared reading process, which is also part of it. So in terms of political subjectivation. So in fact, I think the book itself is an act of distributed leadership, because it is trying to help us think together collectively as, you know, where are we currently in the current stage of the political development of the group that we call we. And so, and in terms of who is that group that we call we, I mean, I also like the way that you'd strongly make the case for the, perhaps the, well, maybe I'm interpreting, but also I think you say it, which is that the we-ness comes from the shared conviction that we need some kind of global systemic change, that whilst there is and should be changes at the local level, at the same time we need to have some kind of vision of global systemic change, otherwise we're kind of left with the same global system, which is capitalism, which is the thing that we need to have a shared goal of needing to be able to change in order to really solve the problems that we're dealing with. So I mean, basically I was really very pleased to read all of that and to have it spelled out so nicely, and to have it, and also to be the historical way that the whole argument kind of comes, and how we kind of think about where we're going and where we are historically is I really enjoyed. And then there's a lot in there as well. I mean, it's a big book, which is also, I think, why it's so good as an act of distributed leadership in terms of creating political subjectivation, because it's a big book and it helps us to kind of think through these big ideas and questions that we're generally grappling with. And I think we are, like you say, at a new point in terms of trying to grapple with those questions. So it's perfectly timed as well. And for that reason, it also gave me lots of questions, which I've tried to write down and thought I might be able to get through, but I'll probably just keep going until Phoebe looks angry at me and tells me to stop talking. But so like some of the questions that came to me were, first of all, because there's a strong argument obviously against spontaneity as the sort of, if we're saying that spontaneity was the idea of 2011 and that was basically gone too far in one direction. And I did sort of wonder, well, did anyone really believe in spontaneity that much in 2011? And I wondered whether maybe some people over-egged the argument, but really were we anyway doing a more kind of, well, I'll call it distributed leadership or historic, neither vertical nor horizontal action in 2011 as well. So the kind of public square occupation type movements, were they already not really spontaneous? And I suppose one of the reasons I asked that is because they did quite quickly morph into what we might call vertical or vertical leaning types of activity. So obviously 15M well, actually most of the public square movements translated into some form of political party focused activity by about 2015. So I wonder whether already they were a bit more pragmatic than having this kind of ideological conviction around spontaneity. And that in itself then made me to start to think about, you know, how do these strategies emerge? And do these, because I think what we're talking about really is a strategic debate. And I wondered, like, how do those strategies emerge? And it's sometimes I think we maybe think that the strategies emerge because we have a good argument. And I wondered really whether the strategies emerge because it's more of a kind of post hoc rationalization, whereby, you know, in 2011, there wasn't much in terms of solid left organic organization that was that could have done perhaps what it was able to do later on in that decade. And so in a sense, that was what was possible in that point of neoliberal capitalism in 2011. And that's why we saw kind of horizontality and maybe spontaneity, not necessarily because it was a good idea, but rather because that was what was possible at that point in time. So I wonder whether what we're doing now is grappling with the question of, well, how do we build a strategy for the kind of, first of all, the turn to populism parties and so on that went on through the 2010s, and now a kind of experience of maybe that doesn't work either kind of feeling. So we're trying to deal with the question I think of like, how do we deal with the failures that we experience? And so I guess that did make me think then about the question of, if your argument is that we should sort of be open-minded, which I think maybe I'm transposing my interpretation of your argument. But anyway, if the argument is that we should be experimental and not ideologically fixed to a particular strategic choice, do we then risk throwing out the learning that we've actually experienced, which is that maybe there are certain problems attached to certain strategies. Maybe parties do lead to co-optation, and maybe horizontalism leads to like futility. So I wonder, like, maybe we need to acknowledge those. And I'm going to stop, I think, because could go on for a long time. But I'll just maybe if I just
go ahead.
Quickly finish then. Yeah. So because I guess my question, I guess the reason I was asking that kind of question is I was starting to think, well, are we grappling with these problems all the time? Because you talk about Rosa Luxemburg and the mass strike in the book, and I think she might be saying something similar, which is, you know, revolts will turn up and we can't quite predict when and what it will happen, but we need to be ready and have some form of organization, but not a rigid one, to be able to respond and to fuel those. So I wonder, are we kind of constantly going to be sort of in this, is this basically what's available to us in terms of strategic choices, or are we stuck with failure, or is it, how do we get out of that sort of that cycle, I suppose, of like dealing with failure and trying to think of new ways and so on. And then the very last point I wanted to talk about was like Zoom, like how, because I started to think, well, like, have we dealt with properly with the question of Zoom, and like basically has Zoom solved the problem of organization? Because we can actually now, without leaving my room, actually, in fact, without leaving the house today, we can quite easily organize this kind of mass discussion easily on multiple occasions all day. We can easily do that without ever leaving the house. So in one sense, Zoom has solved the problem of organization, and I wonder whether, obviously I don't think it really has solved it. So what sort of impact, I was wondering, does that sort of, this, like the lifestyle, that the post-pandemic Zoom focused lifestyle, does that create in terms of our questions of political organization? Okay, sorry for being so long. Thanks.
Thank you very much, David. And I want to kind of also flag that the book, that this project started, Rodrigo, I think you started it in 2013, didn't you? So I think there's a real, it's the very fact of it being published in the context of our political moment now, I think that, and David's just alluded to this as well, that we've got a lot of new tensions that are arising, which make it a very important set of, I think, also quite difficult questions that you're asking. So how do we understand what is failure? Are we looking at controlled failure? Are we looking at what kind of learning can come out of that? For me, I would just say two things and then absolutely turn it over to the floor. The three things that stood out for me and why these questions need to be asked and what in such a moment, because the questions you're asking are going to be difficult in terms of the left discourse and left discussions, because first of all, the question of failure and how to understand that really matters. We've been through a series of potentially what look like failures, because of, in the end, we are actually talking about an antagonist. We're talking about becoming more protagonistic in that sense, which is of course the far right. And we are talking about the appropriation of even the kinds of models that you're going through, Rodrigo, in the text, and then thinking through what is populism, thinking through what does it mean in terms of triangulation of this kind of violence around mechanisms and means that then that are very difficult to sort of say, is there an argument to kind of subvert in a way this horizontalist understanding. Then the second one has to do with the approach itself and what that needs to look like. But then the final thing that links also with your point, David, is again this kind of underlying question of surveillance, which really matters when we are starting to discuss any kinds of transformations within the ways of understanding and thinking through the left and the next stages of strategy, and then of course tactics around that. So what do we do when of course that physicality might be over, might be not necessarily as relevant, but of course then what is the counterpoint of that? So that's why I'm curious around the way that you do it in the book is very, very excellent, where you are constantly interplaying from, for example, the tension of information versus the kind of more understandings of what maybe there needs to be more of a block of information and those things. I'm not going to dominate the floor at all. I would like to open it up for conversation. If you wanted to raise your hand as a reaction, that would be useful. Okay, let me just do that. Who came first? Because I can only look at so many people until I put this out. I see Peter, and I'm gonna do this in a different way. So I have Peter. Go ahead and go first, Peter, and then I'm gonna have a good look around to see who else is. And thanks again for your really excellent points, Melany and David, and Rodrigo as well, very much so. So go ahead, Peter.
No, I mean, I'm a very big fan both of the book and what it's trying to achieve. and I think it does achieve. So if what I asked seems a bit pointed, it's because it's one of the few books that has a huge ambition, I think moves towards achieving that ambition. And I think it's one of those things that, as Phoebe said, I can imagine when it was started to write it and when it was finished, so much had happened, and yet the fact that it was still so relevant, I think speaks to its value, and it's going to be sustained value. My question is a little bit, though, in terms of almost the agnosticism that kind of comes through in the book, which is, we're looking at ecologies here in terms of organization, and we almost have to make it fit the moment in terms of this. And clearly, I think that you are not trying to go into mere opportunism, but I think there is a very refreshing sense of trying to take advantage of opportunities. And I think Melany did a very good job of explaining why you have to be very context dependent on that, which I think you would agree. But when I was reading it, it kind of struck me almost as if I was reading, if you use different case studies and different examples of kind of the type of work that you would see in kind of almost mainstream management studies, which is like, capitalism is extremely insatiable in terms of its organization, right? I mean, capitalism loves distributed leadership, right? Every corporation loves collaboration and cooperation. So what is very interesting then is when we start to move from the political to the material here, right? Which I think part of what you're trying to do does seem to achieve that. Can we start to talk about, well, what are the types of things that allow us to move from making more serious but often quite localized forms of political change that do require, as you said, an ecology of forms, to things that are allowing us to create, in the first place, more sustained parallel forms of material reproduction based on alternative post-capitalist values like commons ownership? And then secondly, from that, what does that then mean for the ways in which there's certain types of forces and ecologies as part of those processes, right? Whether it's in a process of resistance or whether it's in a process of kind of alternative building or whether it's a process of actual transformation that may actually have more relevance in those stages than others. So in a certain sense, I think it's almost as if, and I hate to say it's like, there's almost like a second book to be written about, well, you've laid the groundwork for, I think, ecologies is a very strong methodological and in many ways epistemological framework. But then it's a question of, what does that then say about the fact that we can go beyond just the kind of insatiable ways capitalism will use anything in terms of profit extraction towards something to say, well, what does this tell us then for the construction of serious sustainable alternatives?
Rodrigo, would you like me to take some more questions, or would you like to respond at the moment? Or you're on mute. What would you prefer?
I think maybe we could take a few more, and then I mean,
Sure.
we'll probably end up going a little bit over time anyway, right?
I'm okay to do that, and I don't want to sort of assume everyone. So we've got Eric and Marco with their hands raised. I think Eric was first. Do you want to go ahead and go, Eric, and then Marco, and then you would respond to those? Is that all right, Rodrigo? Does that work? Okay. Cool.
Okay. Hi. First, can we hear me? Oh, okay. Perfect. Maybe this is a question about also in line with the question before about what could follow after this book, like maybe what this book already did and after this. And I'm thinking about and maybe Rodrigo has some thoughts about that already. What we could learn as a left in terms of collective organizational ecology from war and military strategies, like especially in terms of like getting away from some kind of implicit Clausewitzian idea and more into like learning from someone like John Boyd, where it's about you cut off supply lines of the enemy, basically you isolate the elements of the system, and therefore you basically bring down the emergent system. And it's not like you basically strike the enemy where the enemy is at its strongest. Kind of like abstracting abstract models from military strategy and kind of like trying to apply them to political strategy. And if Rodrigo has some thoughts around that, maybe already some ideas about how to work that into his project, etc.
Thank you, Eric. Marco, do you want to go ahead and
Yeah, first of all, thank you for the workshop. My question is about the relations between ideology and organization. It's a problematic, maybe, relation, but the point is whether we need an ecology of ideologies to some extent to have then an ideology of organization, and which come first. Because many times yes, there is there are experimentations about forms of organization that integrate horizontality and verticality, but then they also correspond, especially when the point is becoming subjects that claim for something. In the constructive moment, there may be different understandings of the world and of what we want to achieve overall as critical to a certain kind of rulership. So I was wondering how you think that ideology and organization relate, to what extent shared systems of beliefs enable the ecologies of organization, or whether instead they can be an impediment to advanced resistance. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, would you like to go ahead and respond to those, Rodrigo?
I'll try to. Okay, there's obviously a lot there, and I don't know that I'll be able to do any of it justice, but let me try. And I'm going to do it I'm not going to follow any particular order. I'll just connect the answers as the themes, as the common themes come up. I think that the question, the agnosticism question that Peter raised, and the question of ideology that Marco raised, they connect as well to the point about competition that Melany raised. And you know, and all of those things combine all of those things combine in an answer about, you know, the project of this book, which was really, to a large extent, there's a sort of how to describe this? There's a sort of theoretical subterfuge in the book to the extent that one of the things that I'm criticizing in this, what I have called here today, this theoretical political conjuncture that began in the 1980s and maybe has come to an end now. Two of the characteristics of which are a refusal of to even consider political action beyond a certain scale. So this exclusive investment in the local, where the local tends to be understood in not in a relative sense, but in a very concrete sense as what is the smallest, in the smallest possible scale. And on the other hand, a resource, the other characteristic would be a resource to the science of self-organization, which is then used as a form of compensation for this investment in the local. Because then you can say, well, look at thermodynamics. It tells us that a global transformation is possible through local fluctuations. And part of the way that trick works is you abstract from the language of, say, thermodynamics, everything that has to do with scale, precisely. So you ignore the question of scale, and then you make thermodynamics work in exactly the way you're trying to make it work, to compensate for the fact that you're saying, well, capital is global, we can't and shouldn't act globally, therefore we must invest exclusively in the local. And one of the things that I accuse this use of the scientific discourse of self-organization of doing is to remove the first person perspective. Like, you're always describing self-organizing. You're describing self-organizing social systems from above as if you were outside of them. And you ignore the fact that from a first person perspective, from anyone who's within a self-organizing system, what self-organization looks like is organization, is the effort to organize things. So I accuse that sort of theory of a lack of a first person perspective. And I say it right at the start of the book that one of my goals is to bring back the first person perspective to retain the idea of self-organization, or to retain self-organization as a framework, but to bring back a first person perspective. But then the first person perspective in the book is, it functions in it. The first person perspective in the book is like your political project here. There's like a bracket, and you know, I invite people to fill that bracket with whatever their belief, their political project is, rather than prescribing any particular project. Why did I do that? Well, because I was trying to create a common language that people with very different beliefs and with very different ideologies could use. The effect that I wanted was precisely people with different positions within the spectrum of the left could read that and think, yes, this is useful to think what I'm doing. Which means that, as Peter says, that gives it that sort of distance, that gives the book that sort of distance in relation to the actual concrete wages that should be done here and now. Although it's not a bad thing to say that there's a second book to be written, because, you know, that's I'm sure my editor will be delighted to hear that, if I can make a convincing case as to why that is. And it's the same thing with ideologies. I try to, obviously, yes, and the two things are interrelated. The people choose different forms of organization out of different beliefs or out of different ideologies. One of the things that I'm trying to make people to do is not to confuse their political identity with either their strategy or the form of organization they give themselves. So flexibility in that sense of, actually, it's not organization. Form is only one aspect of organization, and you have to constantly ask yourself what your intervention is actually doing within the broader ecology that you're situated in, so that your ideological position doesn't exhaust the question of either strategy or organization, because both of those things have to be contextual. Both of those things happen within an ecology in a determinate conjuncture. So in that sense, again, I sort of, you know, I tend to underplay the importance of ideology, because on the one hand, I'm trying to tell people, look, I think you can use these ideas that I'm proposing. You can use this language that I'm proposing, regardless of your ideology. And also, regardless of what your ideology is, I think these ideas will help you go beyond that, or will help you go beyond just turning your ideology into an identity that you then perform regardless of context, regardless of situation, and regardless of who else you're performing it with.
Rodrigo, can I put
yes.
is that okay? 'Cause this might be a good time for me to sort of say something, because that's exactly what I was alluding to previously. And it's a very provocative question, but it's one of the ones I have in terms of the book. And the reason I'm interested in it is because you're proposing, and I do see it as being quite a different proposal epistemologically, in the sense of, but you were bringing together what certain arguments that are, of course, themselves sometimes from quite different traditions, and then going through those and kind of really combing through them to see what the possible, what you can develop and add to that. But then ultimately with the frame, with the ontological, very Spinozian kind of understanding. And I really appreciate that. What I'm wondering though is then how dangerous is it then to say that let's say it is a modus operandi, let's say that you have proposed something concrete in a sense. What is to prevent a kind of a far right kind of set of ideas of entering that domain? That's kind of what I was alluding to previously, and you've mentioned it in terms of ways of talking through what is failure, or talking through those things. But that's why it's a quite provocative question, and of course we also now have you, Valerie, to ask a question.
I mean, sorry.
I don't know if we want to go ahead and have Valerie say something as well. And
I just wanted clarification. You mean what? Is there anything to prevent this from being potentially used by the far right?
Well, there are different revolutions, as well, as we well know. This could be passive. We could be talking about a passive revolution, and you do actually go through this series of historically what are revolutions. It's a provocative question, and it may absolutely rubbish.
No, the very direct answer to it is I think there's nothing. I think there's nothing in anything that prevents it from being used by anyone.
Okay, great. And so there's
as simple as that.
We really have to consider this. See, that has to go in and tell the editors. So Valerie, please.
Yes, no problem. First, I really appreciate the book, so thank you. If it's possible, I would like to hear your thought about the concept of pluriverse and your intellectual connection, maybe with some decolonial authors also who thought about radical relationality and acting ecologically. So I have not seen that in the book, and I just wanted to know. Karen Barad also comes to my mind. And another question, you don't have to reply if it doesn't interest you, but what is your thought about specific instantiation of organizational initiative of the global left? For instance, there's Progressive International right now, which try to unite and lead the global left. So what are the main pitfalls and or opportunities those type of transnational organization may face? So thank you.
In relation to your first question, there's a lot of stuff that I wish I had the time and space to work into the book, and I didn't. That is one of them. You will see, for example, bits of there's a couple of references to Eduardo Viveiros de Castro's work, for example, on Amerindian perspectivism, but it's never really quite to Amerindian perspectivism that I'm referring, and it's very peripheral. I don't think there's any reference to Karen. Yeah, I'm pretty sure there isn't any reference to Karen Barad. But that, alongside with the question of military strategy, which was another area that I wanted to work into it, which may sound, absurd to say, oh, I wished I could have connected feminist science studies decolonial thought and military strategy, but that was kind of the ambition of the book. I was trying to bring, because I thought there were bits in these different traditions that could be useful or that were relevant to the discussion, but in the end, a lot of it I had to just maybe that's going in the second book. I'm getting excited about the thought of writing a second book now to address these gaps in the first one. But I was going to connect this to one of the questions before, but I think I lost the thread now.
Take your time. I think I want to ask David. This normally goes for an hour or more. I think it's normally an hour, but it feels so short. David?
We can go for an hour and then longer if we want, depending on what we want to do.
Well, Rodrigo, how do you feel?
I'd be happy to go for I don't know,
Another
15
5
minutes
hours.
more.
Boot camp.
Another 5 hours. Sure.
Okay, if there are other questions, then people with
you're all my hostages now.
That's it. That's it. So in the Zoom room, if people do need to go, clearly this technically would end now. I'm more than happy to continue chattering away. If others have points they want to make. If not, we can also bring the seminar to a close. I'm happy either way.
Right.
Go ahead.
If I can, there's because there were a couple of things from there was one that there was Melany's point about competition, which I just wanted to, and I'm not sure I understood the point entirely. If she wants to clarify it further, but there was just one thing you said that I would change slightly. I don't think I made an argument about the necessity of eliminating competition. I think the argument is what I tried to propose is that people view competition as being, because competition is part of being in an ecology. And I think it's okay that people are competing with one another. The question is, can they compete with one another in more productive ways? Can you compete? And this goes back to the question of agnosticism and the question of ideologies. Can people compete with one another in ways that aren't just going to destroy whatever the common ground was? So I think one of the things that's worked out well in Chile is precisely the fact that people, that different parts of the movement there are in competition, but the competition is within certain limits, and they're very aware of the risk of allowing the competition to go as far as damaging what is a common ground for everyone. It's much better if you're competing around something that's progressing and that's winning, rather than competing to the point that you're actually losing. And I think in Chile so far, people have managed to do that very well, which demands a very particular kind of discipline from different political actors, which is the discipline in managing tension, which is not avoiding tension, which is not creating tension, because precisely you want to produce tension because you want to nudge things in this or that direction. But at the same time, you're aware of, well, too much tension could just endanger the process as a whole, and that you have to keep that within a certain limit. I think Peter had a...
Peter, go ahead. Yeah, Peter. Peter?
Yes, I mean, I just, one of the points that I thought was really brilliant about your book, and kind of the approach, is something that actually is very important, which is that there tends to often be a liberal fetishism where we think ideology comes before organization. And what happens then is that we kind of reify things as assuming they're part of a particular mode of production. So we say competition is necessarily intrinsic to capitalism. But what we've actually seen when you go is that, I like this term actually, that there's, there was capitalist ecologies, of which part of which they picked up on organizationally was competition, right? But at the same time, if you look at things like the Paris Commune, competition was a fundamental part about the ways in which they organized themselves. So I think one of the things that I did like about your book, and I actually think the agnosticism, like I said, I think that's a positive, because it's wonderfully descriptive, and it is a kind of radical gesture to start moving beyond a particular liberal way of looking at history, which is, you have these ideologies and they produce certain values that dictate organization. And I think we have seen, in fact, that, even when we look at things like I was speaking about, like the commons, like some of the most sustainable commons forms that existing today, use what would otherwise be considered quite capitalist modes of value creation, such as competition, but in ways that are radically different and make radically different gestures. While some of the most profit extractive things use things like cooperation and collaboration in quite co-optive ways.
Yeah.
Should you want to take any more questions, or want to go straight in?
I think Melany.
I saw her raised hand. I was not sure. Yeah, Melany. Yes, exactly. Maybe okay.
Yes, just to come back to what you were just saying, I think, yeah, that sort of answer what I was asking, if that my question wasn't really clear. But what I find interesting about what you're saying here is the idea of having a common ground. And I feel like with the book, what I find it very clear in the book is that building the common ground, it doesn't feel that it comes from that sort of traditional ideological formation, right? That all the Leninists have to come together and decide how the party is going to look. All the autonomists are going to define how the self-organization and the local garden is going to look like, right? So it's not that common ground actually come from the organizing, which I think it is a very interesting way of thinking about political ideas and the formation of political ideas. I'm more interested in perhaps not so much in the strategic ways in which organizations continue to exist, but how political ideas maintain themselves throughout time. So how we, for example, continue to build this sort of anti-neoliberal idea, which is a global idea now, right? We kind of building it at the local scale from different dimensions, and anti-neoliberalism looks different in Chile, how does it look here in the UK, and it looks similar to other extents, but that I think that is very interesting to place how political ideas also are part of the process of organizing, right? That is this sort of, and you put it very nicely, I can't remember which chapter it is, but almost that you need that one individual in the assembly to say, hey, what about this idea, right? And yes, that kind of made me think about how the potentiality of continuation, and that's what I was linking it with, and giving the example of the student movement as being a force of continuation, right? You do need some sort of organization that can cut through history to maintain that sort of like force running, and not starting over again, because that perhaps one of the main questions that the left tend to have is like, why we always have to start from zero, right? Why we always have to rebuild that common ground to sort of restart the process. But yeah, that sort of answer my question of what all the lines of what I was thinking before. Thank you.
I think it might be on page 62, but I think it might also be said in other places. And I have, course, do you want to go ahead and respond now, Rodrigo? I keep seeing hands, and then I keep thinking I should say, it's up to you how you want to do it.
No, let's take one more, and then
okay, if that's okay. Oh, why not? Orson had.
I mean, I was already overwhelmed with the amount of points earlier. It's even worse now, but I'll try to
let's keep building
make
on
a
that.
semblance of sense.
A semblance of sense for the assembly. So I don't know where, if Orson still has your hand up. Where are you there, Orson? Where are you? Where are you? The strange thing is I don't have Orson's hand.
Can you hear me?
Oh, there you are. Hi, hi, hi.
Oh, yeah.
Hello, hello.
Hi, everyone. It's a great discussion. I missed the book. I didn't read it, but I just I am going to read it immediately. But it's a great discussion. I got the idea. I was wondering. In last years, I was working on cybernetics, systems theory, Bogdanov especially, and I saw Rodrigo is referring some of these fields and work. I think it would be really interesting to hear Rodrigo from you. How would you link this discussion, to the discussion of verticality and horizontality took place at that time, before Russian Revolution, in Russia and in Europe, actually, the Council Communism or left communism, anti-Leninist Bolshevism. The Bogdanov was really into that, key figure in that discussion. So I would wonder, how would you link these two discussions from different centuries? Shortly.
Well, in order to get the long answer, you will have to read the book. There's a fair amount of that in the book. But I would say, and this connects to one of the points that David raised. I would say that the what is original in what I'm trying to do in the book is not I'm rejecting. I'm trying to reject the grammar of verticalism and horizontalism in the same way that I'm trying to reject the grammar of spontaneity, which is not the same as rejecting spontaneity, and it's not the same as rejecting what is perfectly reasonable in the discussion about horizontality and verticality. I think, people's concerns about verticality are perfectly legitimate in the same way that lots of people's concerns about the limits of horizontality are perfectly legitimate. But again, I'm trying to get us outside of thinking about those things as forms that one has to choose and as being necessarily inscribed in certain organizational forms. So there would be organizational forms that would be naturally vertical, and there would be organizational forms that would be naturally horizontal. To get us thinking about the relationship, to get us thinking about those two things as two tendencies in a spectrum, and what determines where you're going and where you're positioned in the spectrum at any given time is not only the forms, the organizational forms that people give themselves, but also the forces that, and the balance of forces within those organizations and between those organizations and their outside. So, for example, to come back to the question of competition, another thing that I wished I could have worked more organically into the book, and I didn't, and again, it's going to sound very weird because it's, again, coming from a very different place, was was early modern republicanism. Of course, there's Spinoza, there's Machiavelli in the book, but I wanted to bring that more openly and more explicitly and more in a more developed way into the book. And one of the ideas there in Machiavelli, for example, was precisely of the need for, or the advantages of competition among elites. You want there to be, and this is more or less where the idea of diffuse control within an ecology is coming from in the book. The idea that if you have different groups, or if you have different organizing nodes of more or less the same size, more or less the same weight for the ecology competing, that can actually be good for them and for everyone else. I think that's the case with a place like Chile. I think that was the case for a while in a place like Spain, for example. That was what allowed the movements that emerged out of those protests in those countries to last over time, was a combination of, on the one hand, lasting organizing cause, even more so than organizations, because the example that Melany gave was very good. The way in which student leaders went from the student movement and from like the major organizations within the student movement to setting up parties and starting their own political careers or their own institutions, etc. What you have there is actually not organizational continuity, because they left the organizations in which they were, but there is an organizing core of student organizers who then take the prestige, the contacts, the experience, etc., that they'd acquired within those organizations, and they use it to develop other parts of the ecology. So on the one hand, you have a certain continuity of organizing cores which sustain the ecology over time. On the one hand, you don't have any of those taking over the ecology too quickly, which means precisely that there is more competition, and competition ends up being ends up profiting those organizations, ends up benefiting the ecology, and logically, as an extension, also those organizations, because they're dealing with a stronger, a more active, a more mobilized ecology. And the same thing applies for spontaneity. David asked, did people really believe in spontaneity in 2011? And I would say one of the things that I point out in the book is, well, precisely one of the problems of the grammar of horizontality is that it forces you to lie to yourself all the time about what it is that you're actually doing. You're constantly saying, and I bet everyone here who's been in contact with movements of this kind has had this experience of talking to people who are very clearly the leaders in whatever space they're in, and they're saying, well, you have to understand that we're a leaderless movement, blah, blah. So one of the reasons for getting over the grammar of horizontality was precisely solving this problem, solving this difficulty of this bad conscience that this grammar forced people into, which doesn't mean people didn't believe in spontaneity. I think they believed in spontaneity as what I take spontaneity to actually be. So the problem with the grammar of spontaneity, as I understand it, is precisely that it pits spontaneity against organization. Spontaneity is the opposite of organization, in the same way that self-organization would be the opposite of organization, which is even more counterintuitive.
Also,
And
we have Malu as a. Oh, sorry, I'm interrupting completely. Sorry.
Yes.
Did I? Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Sorry. I wasn't sure if that was the end of a sentence. No, it's okay. We have one other
Right.
person who wants to ask. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm finishing. I'll be done as soon as I finish the sentence. The point of countering the grammar with spontaneity was precisely to offer a different definition of spontaneity, which I think is a lot more useful and a lot more productive, which is spontaneity is not the absence of organization. Spontaneity is the emergence of organization. Spontaneity is the moment when patterns of organization start emerging. And then you can do with those, or what people will do with those will depend on a number of different things within that context, but spontaneity is the emergence of patterns of organization, and that emergence is always induced by what? Well, by people organizing things. It's because people are organizing things that those patterns can emerge. So there is no opposition between, or no contradiction between spontaneity and organization. Mm-hmm. Right, that was it. That was the end of that sentence. It was a very long sentence.
Keep going, come on, there's more to come. I want to hear more.
No.
So, absolutely. You know, Manu as well had a point. Go ahead, Manu. Please. This is great.
Yeah, thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yeah, great. So I haven't read the book yet as well, but I bought it, and it's on my book list. And I was just trying to do research around community-led initiatives. They are trying to bring together the social inclusion, environmental sustainability, and democratic forms of participation. And what strikes me is that those are very local and niche organizations and solutions that are led by alternative types of organizations, such as co-ops, social enterprises with more democratic forms of governance and control. And they are mainly community-led, which means they also have to engage with the local ecosystem. They might have some regional influence and have their own networks, such as the Garden Cities movement, tiny house community movement, the community supported agriculture. And then you have other methodologies and other pedagogies, if you may, of change around those areas, such as the circular economy and donut economics, which try to bring the idea of systemic change. And I usually struggle to understand how those local and regional initiatives and movements connect between themselves and connect in a more global way as well, because they do have their own networks, but those networks don't necessarily speak to each other. So we have local and regional movements, but we don't have a movement of movements. And I wonder whether movements of movements could be even detrimental to the impact that those different movements are trying to achieve. And ultimately, whether we need this centralization of a global movement around those alternatives for capitalism. So I'm just wondering what would be your thoughts on that?
That is a great question, and I think it actually gets me to the point where I really started thinking about these questions, and not only thinking of them as practical problems, but also progressively realizing some of the theoretical issues that were involved in them around issues around scale, around the difference between what I call in the book bounded and unbounded organizations, or bounded and unbounded totalities. So the difference between ecology and organization, which is fundamental to the book, because the context in which I started thinking about these things was the World Social Forum in Brazil, in which I was involved in the first 3 editions, particularly the second and third, and then the 5th when it came back to Porto Alegre. And that sort of question that you just asked was one of the big questions in everyone's minds at the time. Like, should the World Social Forum become this? Should it become the movement of movements? Should it become the movement to which all other movements become? Or should it remain a space where people come and go, but there is no there, like there is, the space only exists for the duration of the space, and the structure that exists to keep the space only exists in order to open that space for people, but this is not trying to become an organization, etc. And on both, the interesting thing in that discussion was that on both sides of the discussion, people still believed that that it was possible to create the thing that everyone was going to belong to, and that it was desirable. So the argument for the people who defended the idea that the WSF should become a movement was, well, we've managed to bring people from all over the place. They're interested, they're coming to this thing. This is a unique opportunity. We need to institutionalize this and turn this into the movement, the global movement of movements. And the space people were saying, well, you can't do this. If you try to institutionalize it, you're going to kill it. We need to keep this open as a space, the space of all movements. So on both sides, there was the assumption that you were creating the thing, the umbrella that everyone was going to belong to. The question was, should we institutionalize it as a movement who's then going to make decisions on behalf of all the movements that participate in it, or should it just remain the space that everyone is going to belong to? What happened with time was it became clear that that was just a space among several others. So even the idea that, oh, if we keep it open as a space instead of institutionalizing it, it will continue to be the space to which everything else belongs, was wrong, because there's always something else. There's always going to be something else. There's always going to be other people organizing elsewhere, and who don't want to come here and organize with these people because, it's too far to fly here, or because they don't see any immediate need for organizing with these particular people here, so on and so forth. There'll be trillions of reasons of why that is the case. In both cases, the mistake that people were starting from was they thought it was possible to contain an ecology within something. And I think it's neither possible nor necessary. And I wouldn't say even it's undesirable, because if you try it, what's going to happen is the ecology will just continue to exist around you. So it doesn't change anything. You will try to do it. Some people will come, other people will ignore you. And that's just the way things work. So on the other hand, it's obvious that and this became very clear to me a few years later when I was working as a labor organizer in London. And I was working for a campaign that was started, that followed the SEIU model from the US in the UK, and talking to the SEIU people, understanding what their global strategy was, I could tell, yes, they're doing exactly what needs to be done. They have realized, well, we're dealing everywhere with companies that are global. Every local union campaign that we have is dealing with global companies. We need to match them at the global level. We need to build capacity at that level to face these companies in this sector. That got me thinking, well, yes, precisely the kinds of scaling up we need happen between this mirage of the absolute umbrella that everything was going to come under, and the extremely local level where you might have local wins, but you never match the capacity that capital has to act at a much broader scale. So you need to build the intermediary level where you have different actors, different coalitions, whatever, that can match or at least come closer to matching the power that capital has in scale. Again, if you have several of those at the intermediary scale, that's better for everyone, I believe, because it's good. One of the problems with the SEIU was they were the first union thinking in those terms, and they got there first. They made themselves the first global player, and then everyone was dependent on the strategy of one organization, which wasn't always the best strategy for the ecology, because they were thinking of what was in the interests of the SEIU. So if you have different things that can work at this intermediary level, that compete but can also potentially cooperate with one another, then that means that you're closer to matching that power that capital has at scale, while also preempting the risks that the people who defended the idea of the WSF as space were arguing against in relation to the idea of institutionalizing the World Social Forum as a movement. It was a very long-winded answer, but I hope I gave you some idea of how I'm thinking about these things.
So I'm looking at the room, and we still have a lot of people here, 23 to be precise, which is a really great sign that people are enjoying this. I am conscious it's already 6:30, which means we've gone quite a bit over time, and people might want to do other things. We can do a kind of a vote if people would like to continue. Actually, I would just like to ask you, Rodrigo, maybe you are too tired. I mean, this might be quite fatiguing. It's up to you. What do you think? And a lot of affective labor as well that I'm busily measuring over here. No, would you like to continue? I mean, in my case, I need to leave. So either I'm going to hand chairing over to someone, or Eric has a question. Should we go for about 10 more minutes? And then what do you think? Because you've already said 15 and we already exploited you for another 15. You let me know.
That was mostly self-exploitation, though.
Oh, I
me
see.
talking for 15 minutes.
Okay. As you want.
But yeah, sure. If people want to go for 10 minutes more, I'm
okay,
happy.
let's do 10 more minutes, and then if people need to take their own comfort
Pretty
breaks,
sure I won't die.
as you want. Okay, as you want. Thank you very much for this. And Eric has a question, and also thanks to all of the other people who've been pitching in. This is brilliant.
Yes. Okay. So I wanted to ask specifically about what you just said, Rodrigo. With okay. I'm trying to find words. I'm sorry. So basically, that when it comes to decisions about okay, hey, is in a given situation, is it better to concentrate power and to kind of like say, okay, let's build a monopoly of like one organization because their power is concentrated, or is it a better decision to say, okay, no, let's disperse power, so we basically are not as dependent on this one organization for like when this organization gets like captured, gets like co-opted into dynamics that are undesirable, which make it unproductive. Yeah, but there is certainly this trade-off between, okay, if you centralize, you have more power, but what you pay for that is you also get very vulnerable. Whereas when you disperse power, you get less vulnerable, but also you have less power. And and okay, maybe one could have like, when one strategically as like one person or in a group thinks about that question, okay, what makes more sense? Should we disperse power in that regard, or should we centralize? And one may come up with a calculation and say, okay, this is the right decision. But the thing is, and I think like you said that already, of course, there is no actor which could then impose this decision. And my question is, okay, how do you think should this decision, making this decision based upon this calculation, how should this translate into actual organizational behavior? Is basically the only possible way just to say, okay, hey, everybody for themselves, so everybody in their organizations and groups that they already have to make this decision, have to make this calculation, and there basically from the bottom up, this decision has to translate into actual behavior, or is it like, is that basically the only way, or how did you think about that? Yeah.
Hang on, what's the only way?
Sorry, that the only way basically is, okay, hey, basically everyone or every organizational unit, so to say, that exists in this moment has to go through this decision of, okay, does it make more sense to centralize power in like one, or like to centralize power more in like fewer organizations, or in a given scenario, or if it makes sense on a specific scale and a specific scenario to disperse power more, so we are less dependent upon one or a few kinds of organizations. And we might say, for example, in a scenario where, okay, we really need to shoot our shot and to really say, okay, we need to concentrate power, otherwise we don't stand a chance. That means we have to take in the risks of what that means. But if we like just disperse, we will never get anything done. And like, okay, you have to make like risk management, risk calculation in that regard. But of course, there isn't like this one brain of the left that kind of like, okay, it makes this decision once and then this automatically translates into actual behavior. But like, how does this decision, who makes these decisions, and how does this translate into actual organizational behavior? Yeah.
I mean,
well,
how the
5 minutes you could.
How the decision is made will depend, like, you know, obviously this depends on whether it's like a pool of different organizations coming together, how those organizations are organized themselves, etc. So it's impossible to answer this in abstract. In having said that, I'll do exactly that. because I think there is something you can say in abstract, which is, well, for the most part, I think, at least nowadays, in the conditions that we operate now, I think this tendency, I think this kind of choice tends to be made by individuals more than organizations. Why? Because one of the main ways in which in which organizations might begin to concentrate power is through social media and through, presence in the media in general, and the fact that people are responding to them. So actually, you tend to have. And this becomes clear, for example, in Paulo Gerbaldo's work on digital parties. There tends to be a contradiction between the individuals who are there more as consumers and therefore tend to be happier to just empower the leadership of the party to do whatever, because they have kind of, as individuals, they've kind of delegated the responsibility of making big calls about strategy to the leadership. And the more organized base, who would like to have more of a say, but their capacity to withhold that decision until, for example, they can obtain certain concessions from the leadership of, say, the party to whom they are granting that power, their capacity to withhold that decision is kind of overridden by the fact that there's loads of unaffiliated individuals making that decision. So yeah, there isn't a single way. Basically, there isn't a single way in which that decision is made. I think generally the tendency is that decision is made by individuals more than it's made by organizations, or even if it's done by organizations, that will mean nothing unless it's also done by the individuals in those organizations and the individuals in the area of influence around those organizations. And so the best we can do is to make people aware that they're making this kind of choice. And maybe I didn't flag that sufficiently in the book, but yeah, like there is an aggregate power of decision making that unaffiliated individuals have within an ecology that can very easily override any of the existing organizations within an ecology, especially if those organizations aren't particularly large. So the best you can hope for is that people realize when they're making that kind of decision.
Well, I wish that you were here, Rodrigo. We could all just go to dinner and the pub, and then we could hear more and more and more and more and more and more about this excellent book. And we hope you can come over here soon. You're not finished with your sentence.
Are you all in the same room, just pretending?
Yeah,
you're in different places. Is that what's going on here?
You had a really great audience. I think it was, not that I quantify anything, but it's really, really, I would not do such a thing. I'm very, very happy that Melany, you were here with us and you gave your excellent interventions. And of course, David, who is again coordinating all of the CPERN, along with Yulia Rudchenko, who I don't think could make it, but I wanted to thank you for all of your extra unpaid labor, and we pay you in this political hopeful set of motivations, which I feel very motivated in terms of what this book has made me think so much, and I have so much more to do. And I hope that's all been the same for our amazing audience. Thank you for being here.